Hi everyone. This is a tutorial to teach you how to create a project in Next.js. It's aimed at people who are at least familiar with Next.js, so someone who's read through the documentation, knows the basics of what Next.js is, what it does. Maybe you've done a project or two in it personally, or worked with a team on an existing project. The goal here is to teach you how to set up and configure a Next project yourself using some of the best practices that'll help you, scale it to a large app with a team of other developers and keep it under control. We'll be using things like Typescript. Certainly, we'll be implementing our linters, formatters, setting up the configurations for those. We'll be implementing some Git Hooks with Husky to make sure that all that stuff is run automatically on our commits before we push. We'll be showing you how to add Storybooks so you can do component testing, visual testing if you're working with a designer. We'll set up a debugging configuration, a VS Code configuration. We'll create a few sample components, and we'll create a template that you can use kind of as a base to copy whenever you or other developers on your team want to make a new component. So with that said, let's dive right in. And I'll be including the repository for this in the video description. I'll have a blog post that's has a complete kind of written version of this entire tutorial. So if there's anything in the video that you find maybe goes too fast, or you just prefer to read along or double check that way, then please check out the video description and you'll find that there. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by creating a Next.js app with a TypeScript template. So I'm going to run this command here. I've got my command terminal open. I'm going to run npx node package runner create next app --ts for TypeScript, and then just the name of what you want to call it. So I'm going to call it Next.js full stack app template tutorial, just to differentiate it from the one that I created before for this video. So while that's going to run, it's going to install all of Next's dependencies. It's going to install React. It's going to install a default ESLint config. It's going to install TypeScript, the types for React and Node, everything that we need to get the project started. So I have successfully installed it here. So here I've opened up the project we just created in VS Code. This is all the default files and setup that Create Next App gives you out of the box for a TypeScript template. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run yarn install. I'm going to use yarn just because I like it. It's fast. If I want to add workspaces, it's really great for that. If you choose to use npm, that's perfectly fine too. You should have no problem following along with this tutorial using npm. So I'm going to install, and nothing will happen because the Next app installation process already installed all the packages for me, so that's great. And next I want to do the dev script just to create and run a development build to make sure that everything is working. So yarn dev starts up the server on localhost 3000. So visit localhost 3000, and we should have a welcome to Next.js template sample project. So that's great. Pull that out of the way for now. Wonderful. So I'm just going to close my dev build for the time being. All right. And the last thing that we want to do just before we get started is make sure that we can also do a production build just to verify that it works. And the command for that is yarn build, or npm run build if you're using npm. You should get a bunch of different files with a nice little green text showing you that they're small, they're fast. Green means they're below a certain threshold that Next.js recommends for size and speed. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, since the whole idea of this project is to create a strict template where every developer on your team kind of follows the same rules, and you don't have to, or at least worry as little as possible about differences in development methods and coding styles between people on your team. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define the fact that this project is designed to be built and run with Yarn. Again, you could do the same thing with NPM. It doesn't really matter which one. The point is you pick one, and that's what every member of your team uses so that the build process is consistent for everybody. So I'm going to create a file called .nvmrc. And in that file, what that's going to do is it's going to clarify which version of Node that we're using. So the version of Node that we're using is called LTS/Fermium, I guess it's pronounced. That's basically a code word for version 14. So we're using Node, minimum of Node version 14 on this project. And the reason that we use 14 instead of the more common 16 these days, or there's even newer ones now, is that Vercel, which is the company that owns Next.js and the service we're going to be deploying to, they are still currently require you to use Node version 14. So that's just because of our deployment environment, that's what we're going to stick to. So this says that when running this project, we expect to be using Node version 14. And on the package manager side, we're going to create a file called npmrc. Sorry, misspelled there. We have nvmrc, the first one we did. And this one here is npmr. Oh, goodness me, I can't type it. .npmrc. And this is where we define and say that we want the engine that we've specified, the engine being NPM or Yarn or one of the other ones, PNPM, I guess, if you wanted, must strictly be used when working with this project. So when I save that, and then I go into my package JSON file, and I add a new section here, I had it before the scripts, called engines. What this is going to do is say that when we're using Node, we need it to be version 14 or greater, Yarn version 1.22 or greater, and NPM does not allow us to use NPM. So now that I have this set up, if I try to run npm install, which is not something that I should be doing, we've already used Yarn to install all the packages. We have our Yarn lock file to lock all the versions in. Running npm install would create a package lock file and create inconsistencies within our project potentially. Around npm install, I'm going to get an error saying unsupported engine because of my configuration. So that's kind of step one in creating our strict project here. Okay, so moving on, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to initialize our Git repository. So Next.js comes pre-initialized as a Git repository. So if I do ll here, you can see that there's already a .git folder there. You can see that I'm already on the main branch. So I don't need to run git init to create an initial Git repository here. But what I do want to do is I want to create a remote repository on somewhere like GitHub, for example, that I can push to. So I'm going to go and do that right now. So I've logged into GitHub here. There's me. I'm going to click new. I'm going to call it exactly the same thing I've called it here, Next.js full stack app template tutorial. Just give that same as a description for now. I'm going to create the repository. And then GitHub will give me exactly the commands that I need to use to add this as a remote origin for my project here. So going to copy this line to add the remote origin. And then we can commit and push. So what have we done so far? We've locked in the engine. So I'm going to say add git commit the message. For now, we'll just call it the initial commit. We're going to set up a commit linting process soon, which will create a system that we use for different types of commits and create a standard that we use for our commit messages. But initially, Next.js create one, then we're going to create one here just to say that this is the initial commit that we're pushing of our project to GitHub. Do that. and then I'll say git push. And the first time you do it, you have to specify which branch on the remote you want to use. For us, it's going to be the main branch. So say SU for upstream, origin, the name of our remote repository, and the branch main. And that's it. So when I go back to GitHub here, I should refresh and see my Next.js project. Excellent. All right, we're doing good. What's next? So next we're going to install our linters and our formatters. So we use linters, ESLint, which already comes pre-configured in the project for us to ensure a standard of quality and consistency in coding style between different developers on the team. And we use formatters. We're going to use Prettier, the industry standard on that one, to automatically format our code for us. Things like spacing, trailing commas, trailing semicolons, all the stuff that people used to argue over endlessly that really no one wants to be too concerned about anymore. All we really want is to make sure that everyone uses the same style so we can focus on the important stuff while we're developing, like building the app that we want to build. So we're going to begin with ESLint. So like I said, it does come pre-configured with create next app. So if I just use, you can see here, there's a lint script. So if I just do yarn lint, it should automatically run and says it's detected no errors, which is great. Not surprising considering the project is fresh, but we do want to add a few more configurations to it to make it just a little bit stricter. So if I click this file called eslintrc.json, that's the configuration file. By default, it extends this package called Next Core Web Vitals. So we're going to extend that out just a little bit. We're going to switch it up to an array. And we're going to instead extend Next Core Web Vitals and ESLint's recommended settings by default. We are going to add another one here called globals. So what this is going to do is when you use React, I believe as of version 17, you don't necessarily have to import React into the scope of each one of your components. It'll be there globally as long as you're using React. So we can tell ESLint that even if we use React, they don't have to warn us saying that you're using a variable that isn't defined. React will be available as a read-only value globally across our whole project. And lastly, we can add another section called rules, and this is where you'll be able to manually turn on or off any ESLint rules that you like or you don't like. So if you get sick of it warning you about the fact that you're declared variables but you haven't used them yet, then you can set that to either a warning or you can turn it off entirely. Now that is certainly a bad example. What I just said, you should never decide the strictness configuration settings in your project based on getting sick of the warnings, especially if the warnings are valid, which using declaring variables that you don't use is a pretty valid one. So remember, if you're the team lead, then you need to be responsible for making sure that these rules are set in place. They're there for a reason, even if they're inconvenient. But that said, some of the rules, people do have different standards and different coding styles, and maybe there are some that work for your team and some that don't. So discussing it with your team and your organization and deciding which ones are best for you and turning some off isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. So my little rant aside, we're going to at least create the section on rules where you can turn them on and off. And by default, you can turn them off by setting them to 0. You can set them to a warning by setting it to 1. You can just turn them on as an error by setting them to 2. And you can also, depending on the rule, kind of create a specialized version of it. So this is one that I use kind of in all my projects, which takes the rule that says you have unused variables in your project and allows you to prefix them with an underscore. So if I'm working on a new feature, maybe I'll declare variables that I know I'm going to need in the future shortly, but I might want to save partway through developing that feature. So it just allows me to prefix those variables with an underscore and recognize that I haven't used them yet, but I'm planning to get to them later. So I'm going to save this configuration and run yarn lint again. You'll see that we're now getting a warning that we're using an unsupported version of TypeScript, but the only reason we're getting that warning is because we're using the brand new latest version, which to me isn't an issue as long as we're not seeing problems elsewhere. I like, as long as it's not something super critical, using the latest version of TypeScript is usually a good idea. And next we're going to, now that we have ESLint set up, we're going to install Prettier. So to do that, we do yarn add, and it's going to be a development dependency because we only need it while we're developing. Prettier. Hit enter. The other thing you're going to want to have is the VS, if you're using VS Code, the VS Code extension for Prettier. You can see that I have that installed here. Basically, it'll let you set up your editor to automatically format your files while you're working on them, rather than having to run the command line tool separately. So that's a pretty handy thing to have. Just search for Prettier in the VS Code extensions, and it'll be by far the #1 most popular result. So for Prettier, we're going to want 2 files in the root of our project. We're going to start with the ignore file, so .prettier ignore. And all this is going to do is it's basically where we can set patterns of files and directories that we don't want Prettier to format. And that's pretty much going to be all of our automatically generated like build and distribution folders. So I've got a little template here that looks like this. Yarn next, which is where your next builds to. Dist, a common build folder if we ever set that up. And of course, node modules. You don't want to be auto-formatting other people's packages. So I'm going to save that. And then next, we're going to add another file called .prettierrc. And this is our configuration file. Prettier itself is extremely opinionated. It doesn't even let you configure a lot of the stuff that it does, but there's a few kind of core rules that it does. These are 4 of the main ones: trailing commas, tabs, widths, semicolons, and whether you use single or double quotes. Absolutely doesn't matter what values you pick for these. Pick whatever works for you, as long as you keep them consistent. Again, that's what matters. So this file will be contributed to your code repository, so every developer on your team that uses it will have the same values that you do. So now we can go into our package.json file, and we can add a Prettier script here so that we can run it on command. So I'm going to say Prettier, which runs Prettier package. It will write to the files whatever formatting changes it does, it'll save them. And this dot here just means in your whole project directory. But remember, it won't actually run everything in your project directory because we specifically told it what directories and files that we want to ignore in our Prettier ignore file. So save that, give it a try, yarn Prettier. You can see that it went through and formatted a few of the default files, presumably based on the settings that I set in our Prettier RC file. So let's we added some build tools and configurations. Let's do a commit. So git add all those, stage all those files, commit with a message, and I'm going to start using the commit conventions that we're going to be using once we set up the linter, just in advance. So we did some configuration with our build process. So I'm going to call it build and say implement Prettier and configure ESLint and push those changes. Great. What is next? So next we are going to set up our Git hooks. So what is a Git hook? A Git hook is a script that runs at different stages of the Git process. So what I just did, I staged some files, I made a commit with a message, and then I did a push. So those are 3 different parts of the Git process, and each one of those you can set up scripts that have to run and have to run successfully whenever one of those things occurs, otherwise it will fail. So the reason that you set this up is so that you enforce code quality standards that you and other developers on your team have to follow in order to be able to commit to the project, and even more importantly, push to the remote. So each one has different levels of severity. If you put all of your tests and your builds on commit, you can really you can hamper people who are trying to commit partial work along the way. Whether you do that or not is kind of a decision that's up to your team. But having scripts that must succeed before you can push, that's more of a standard that you really might want to have, just so that whatever code is on your remote repository is presumed to be in a working buildable state. So that's what we're going to set up now. So to do that, we're going to use a tool called Husky. So to install Husky, we use yarn. We're going to say yarn add, again, development dependency. We still haven't even started building the app. We're just building our project here. Yarn add Husky. It's going to do that. And then once it's added, then we need to initialize it. So we use our package runner npx, and we're going to say npx Husky install. So you can see here it says Git Hooks installed, and I saw something pop up here. This little folder for Husky was created, and this is going to get committed with the rest of our project code, because once again, we want the scripts that we create here that run for us on each of our Git commits to run for the other developers on our team when they do their Git commits as well. So let's start with a hook that runs every time we make a commit to the project. So the commit that we're going to use there is, we're going to say npx Husky add. So Husky add a new commit hook. We're going to put it in Husky pre-commit. So this is something that'll run each time that you do a commit. And the script that we're going to do is yarn lint. So remember the ESLint config that we set up, the code linter. We want to make sure that passes without any errors if we're allowed to commit to our code. So as soon as I hit enter there, you'll see in this Husky directory, it's created a pre-commit hook, which runs yarn lint. Great. And I'm going to do another one. I'm going to do similar, but this one is for before you push, so you can commit, but before you're allowed to push to the remote, I want to make sure that I'm able to do a successful production build. So npx Husky add pre-push yarn build. And similarly, you can see it's created a pre-push script in my Husky directory. And lastly, what I'm going to do is in my package JSON file here, I'm going to add another script, and it's going to be called prepare. And prepare is a special script that runs whenever you run yarn install or npm install, it runs automatically whatever you have in your prepare script. So what this is going to do is when other people clone your project and run it, and they run yarn install or npm install, it's automatically going to install Husky to make sure that they all have those pre-commit hooks and pre-push hooks the same as you do. So I'm going to save that, and we can give it a try. So let's say git add, and I'm going to say git commit -m, and I'm going to use a different commit prefix here. I'm going to use CI, continuous integration, because we're working on our integration process here. I'm going to say implement Husky and hit enter. So I'm doing a commit, so I should see that my pre-commit script runs. And as you can see there, look, EXLint, no warnings, so it allowed me to commit. Great. I want to push my code. Shouldn't be allowed to push it unless I get a successful build. Git push. Just doing the push should give me a build process. And if the build process fails, which I don't think it will, nothing has really changed, then it will cancel my push and wait for me to commit new changes that fix it before it allows me to push to remote. Excellent. Everything succeeded, and it allowed me to push. So as I mentioned, what we also want to do is we want to add a linter for our commit messages to make sure that our commit messages between all the members on our team are consistent. So let's do that now. We're going to add a couple of packages this time. We're going to add yarn add, once again, just for development, commitlint / config conventional, and the commitlint CLI. So the CLI is what is going to enforce the commits, and conventional is the sort of pre-configured settings that are a set of kind of common standards that developers used, originally based, I think, on some standards developed by Angular. So I'm going to install those packages. Now, in order to customize commitlint, I'm going to create a folder, a file, a JS file in the root of the project called commitlint.config.js. A new file. You don't necessarily need this file, or if you do use it, you can just say that your configuration extends the config conventional. What I personally like to do is I take the conventional config from the actual package, and I just manually, you'll see here when I paste it, manually paste it into my config file, mostly just so I can double check, what the rules are if I need to. Right? I don't want to be doing a commit and it says, oh, it failed because it's too long or used too many capital letters or didn't use the right prefixes. So this is my custom config based on, it's the same as the conventional one, but because it's here within my project, I can easily see what the different prefixes that I have to use when I make commits are. So save that. Let's give this a try, and let's try something that won't work and then try something that will work. Stage the files. I'm going to say commit implement commitlint, which is true, but I didn't use one of the approved prefixes for my message. So when I try and do that, I'm going to get an error because I forgot my message hyphen. Okay, that has nothing to do with commit. That's just me making a typo. Git commit -m implement commitlint. So it's going to run the linter, and as we can see, it has succeeded. And why did it succeed? I guess I got to take a moment here. So the reason it wasn't working is because I forgot to enable it with Husky. So we need to run a command here, npx husky add commit message, and the command we're going to run is npx no commit edit argument 1, just taken from the commitlint docs. So I run that. It has created a commit message Git hook. So now git add, I'm going to do git commit -m, and this time I'm going to say enable commitlint, and this time it should fail because I've enabled the commit message linting. So I run that, does package linting, and oh, we have an error. Subject may not be empty. I didn't put a subject in my commit message type. Same idea. So putting a subject in there should fix both of those. So I'll say, oh, okay, let's try again. Don't need to stage them again, but we'll say, what are we doing here? We're working on our continuous integration process. So let's say, all right, CI : enable commitlint, enter. And our commit has been allowed to go through. So this, remember, your commitlint.config is where you can see what all the rules that your development team needs to follow for their commit messages. And I've got some comments up here explaining what each one of these different subjects means, in case you aren't sure. And I'm going to push that, and once again I'll get a build process to make sure that my app still builds properly. One thing that you might have to consider in all this is maybe the speed of your machine. If you're running on an older machine and you're just, for one reason or another, not able to run a build process on every push, or running a linter on every commit isn't the right thing for you, you can move that to just push. So you can do more commits where you don't have to go through all these hooks and then wait until you actually push your code to run them. That's perfectly fine. Once again, you decide with your team what works best for you. Okay, more configuration. We want to make sure that we get this project as good as we possibly can before we even begin development on the app. We are going to configure VS Code settings to use some of the things that we've set up. So I'm going to create a directory called .VS Code here, and I'm going to create a file called settings.json. And you'll notice that if you go into your normal VS Code settings, wherever it is, I always forget. You'll just have to use the command palette, Control P, settings. Oh, no, that's not Control Shift. Control Shift P. There it is, the command palette, settings.json. Open settings. Sorry, that was Control Shift P that I pressed on a Windows machine. I assume it'd be Command Shift P, likely on a Mac. This has opened the global settings JSON file for VS Code. So these are all the default settings that are running in VS Code in general for all my projects. When I create a .VS Code folder inside of this project with a settings.json, these are project-specific settings that will overwrite the globals, which has one benefit. You can set things that are specific to this project, like TypeScript settings if we use TypeScript here, but not in other ones. It also has the benefit of being committed to your repository, so any other developers that use VS Code will get these settings as well. So that's a huge, huge benefit, once again, for consistency. So in this settings file, I'm just going to not put too much, just a couple of things. I'm going to set my curlies here. I'm going to set the default formatter to my Prettier VS Code extension. And I'm going to say there's 2 code actions on save. I'm going to fix everything, which will use my formatter. And I'm going to organize my imports, which will just alphabetize the imports for me, which is a nice way to keep them organized. So save that. Now, if I go into, say, one of the files in the project, .tsx, I'm going to add a bunch of completely useless spacing, mess up the imports a little bit, and I'm just going to hit Control S to save. You'll see that it automatically formats it for me. Did it get rid of the spacing? Didn't. Why not? Interesting. I'll have to look at that one further. I'm doing Control Alt F to automatically run the formatter there. Oh, looks like I was just missing the format on save value. So that spacing, hit Control S, and automatically formats it for me. So great. What's next? Next, we're going to add some debugging scripts for VS Code. So again, in our VS Code directory, we're going to create a file called launch.json. And this will have some automatic configurations for launching in different kinds of debug modes. So Next.js themselves on their site, in their documentation, provides a nice template for you. So that's pretty much exactly what we're going to use as is. So you can get that from the code repo for this tutorial, or you can get it from Next.js website directly. But essentially it gives you a server-side debugging script, a client-side debugging script, and a full-stack debugging script. And we can switch these npm runs to yarn commands to match our project. So let's save that. And to run them, all I do is click over here on the Run and Debug tab. I'm going to say, let's do Next.js debug server side, hit play, and it will begin running the debugger for server side code. Could not read source map for file document.js. Look at that one after. Okay, I've got our solution here with our friend from Microsoft says to resolve issues with source maps by adding this value to our launch.json script. So I'm going to do that, format it. Let's try running the server-side debugger again, see if we get the error message. And the error message is fixed. Thanks, Connor4312. Okay, great. So that's some debug scripts, so you can run those if you're debugging server-side, client-side, or full stack, whatever features you happen to be working on at the time. We can also, we're going to add some automatic debugging for the dev environment when we're running it from the command line as well. So to do that, we're going to add a package called crossenv, yarn add -d crossenv. And what this will do is it will make it so that we can set environment variables on the command line for both like Linux, Mac, and Windows as well. Windows is usually the one that has the problem with setting environment variables on the command line, but crossenv makes it easy for cross-platform environment variables. So I'm going to add that to the package. And then in package.json, I'm going to update my dev script. Here you can see where it's next.dev. Instead of that, I'm going to change it to crossenv node options is equal to inspect. And this will let me inspect server-side logs in the browser when I'm running in development mode. Obviously not in production, because that could create some serious security problems. But in development mode, this is officially recommended in the Next.js docs as a way to debug your Next apps while working in the browser. So save that, and we'll just test it with yarn dev. Very good. Everything runs. Double check, make sure we can still load it up on port localhost 3000. We can. Everything is going along very well. So I'm going to close that dev build and I'm going to do a commit. So what kind of commit are we doing? Changes that affect the build system or external dependencies. We added crossenv and some debug and build scripts, so it sounds good to me. Say build, implement VS Code settings, and launch.json debugger. Still lints, good. And we push. All right, what's next? So next we're going to talk a little bit about the directory structure that we're going to use for an app. So we're getting closer to the actual app itself, which for people watching, I'm sure they're thrilled to hear. But again, this stuff's really important, so I want to make sure we get it right. For the directory structure for our app, what I'm going to use and suggest to you is my personal preference. If you have another way of doing it, by all means, of course. The most important thing, I've probably said it 5 times or more now, is to be consistent, not just with yourself, but with the other developers on your team. So you need to come to an agreement, whatever it is, that everyone can work with. Or if you're the leader and you just want to put your foot down and say, this is the way that it is, then that is your choice. But what I just recommend, whatever you choose, stick with it, be consistent with it, reevaluate it. Maybe you use it for a few months and realize, this wasn't quite the right thing for us. Is the time of refactoring worthwhile? Make that decision and go from there. But we're going to keep it fairly simple to the start. We just want to essentially the traditional idea of the model view and controller. We want to separate the view layer, so components, which are basically just UI. We're going to make a directory called lib, standing for library. Like that's where your business logic, your domain application, all that kind of stuff will live. And then we also, just because of the way that Next is set up, we also have this folder called pages, which is basically the actual routes, the pages in your app that consume the components that we're going to put in the components directory. So we already have the pages directory, obviously. I want to create another directory called components, and I want to create another directory called lib. And right now, I'm not even going to put anything into them. They're just placeholders so that we know that that's where the code is going to go when we're ready to write it. So at this stage, I think we're ready to implement Storybook. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Storybook, it is a kind of an all-in-one component demo suite. I guess you could say we can build components and show them and test them in Storybook, so completely isolated from our application. And that's really the key thing here. So if you're working on a card, if you're working on a date picker, if you're working on even just like a layout element, something that like a wrapper for a form or something like that, you can create those components in React here. But rather than having to build and load up your entire application to test them and potentially, have overlap and overhead of other components nearby, you build them in isolation using what's called stories, which are descriptions of props and state for how to render different versions of that component. And Storybook as a tool will display them with those props and state, and also let you change things like the mobile breakpoints, test responsiveness, change the props dynamically with a little UI and controls and buttons to see what they look like in different states. It's a really, really great tool. It's wonderful if you're working with a designer who just wants to be able to see if the individual pieces that you're building for your app look and work the way that you want them to. So it's not designed to test like application logic. You really don't want to use it for getting into things like, certainly not anything to do with page routing or API calls or anything like that. It's very much a visual tool, and we'll implement like unit testing and end-to-end testing for testing how those things work later. For now, we're just going to use Storybook to focus on the visuals. So with all that said, how do we install Storybook? We don't actually add it as a dependency because it does so many different things and creates so many configurations and files within your project. We run it with npx package runner, and we run a command just called sb init. So I'm going to run npx sb init, and I'm going to use the Webpack 5 builder just because anytime that I want to be using Webpack 5 as opposed to Webpack 4. It's the more modern way to do things. I'm honestly not sure why Storybook doesn't default to it, but it doesn't. I hit enter and it's going to start running. So it does a lot of checking what kind of project you're running automatically. So it sees that you're using, certainly that you're using React. It will look for all kinds of different packages and create automatic configurations based on what's going on in your application, which is very cool. So I'll let that install. And while it's installing, I'm going to get ready to update a few configurations. The first one is going to be my ESLint config file. So I'm going to let it finish first because sometimes it edits files. As you can see, do you want to run the ESLint plugin fix on your project? And I'm going to say yes. So it'll add Storybook's ESLint configuration files and recommendations. I did get an error saying that it wasn't able to automatically update my config. It doesn't like the fact that I used a JSON file for the config. That's fine because we're just going to update it ourselves anyway. So I'm going to go into my ESLint config here, and I'm going to add one more new value to here. I'm going to put it at the beginning, and I'm going to use the Storybook plugin. I'm going to add, ignore that. I'm going to add plugin Storybook recommended. So this is the recommended ESLint config for Storybook, and I'm going to add this other section here called overrides. And what it says is what type of files that ESLint will treat as Storybook files. And in our case, it's any file name .stories, .ts, .tsx, .js. We're not going to use any of these JavaScript extensions, but no harm in having them there. And you can have Storybook specific rules. So this is a default one that comes with the Storybook config from their documentation. I'm not even sure what that does, to be honest, but if we do it, we're going to get an error. You can look that up on Google if you want to know more about it. Okay, great. So that's the ESLint config for Storybook. We're also going to go into our package JSON, and we want to verify, since we use the Webpack 5 builder, we want to make sure that Storybook is using, and any other tools are using Webpack 5 whenever they import Webpack. So we're going to add another field here at the end called resolutions. And what that means is whenever you see any of our tools sees import Webpack, we want to make sure that they're using version 5 or greater, because our project itself doesn't have a dependency on Webpack. We don't need to have it in our dev dependencies, but the tools that we're using, we want to make sure that they're using Webpack 5. So save that. And now, because we changed we changed the package.json and the resolutions for the imports in our packages, we need to run yarn install again to make sure that we actually download and install those packages. So it's going to be installing Webpack 5 there if it needs to. Okay, so for configuring Storybook itself, before we start to run it, you can see that Storybook created a couple of new directories. It created a .storybook folder, which is where your configs are, and it created a stories folder, which is where all the different default stories that Storybook creates. You don't need any of this stuff, except that if you're new to Storybook, it's really great to show you templates of how to create a basic story for your components. So if you're new to Storybook, definitely take a look through these files and give them a try. You'll be able to see them when we load up Storybook, which we'll be able to do shortly once we finish our configuration. So I'm going to load up storybook/main.js, and I'm going to update it to look like this. So not too much of a big change. In fact, the only thing that I'm changing here is my stories patterns. I don't want to just only import stories from the stories directory. I want to put them with my components themselves. So I'm going to change that to do any.stories.jsx, tsx, ts files within my project. And I'm also, the other thing that we need to do is we need to tell Storybook where our static asset directory is. So if we want to test components that use images or fonts from our project, we need to add where our static directory is, and by default in Next, that is the folder called public in the root directory. So that defines that there. So format and save that file. And lastly, before we load it up, I'm going to edit this preview.js file. I've got a few personal opinions on this one. There's only one that really needs to be added if we're working with Next.js. We need to tell Storybook how to work with Next's specific image components. If you don't know what those are, you're not familiar with them, I recommend you look up the documentation on Next website. They're a special kind of image different from the regular HTML IMG tag that handles a lot of image optimization stuff that Next does in the background. But since Next is the one that knows how to do that, and your Next server, Storybook doesn't know how they are handled, so we need to define how they're handled manually. So you can get all this code from the example repository that goes with this video. I'm going to paste a bunch of things at once, but I'll go through them just to kind of explain what they are. So this is a set of default pixel breakpoints that I'm going to use in my app. I'm going to create Storybook viewports for each one of them. So what this is doing is it's mapping these numbers here to Storybook's format that it uses to set breakpoints, which is name, the key, XSSM, pretty straightforward, and what styles are going to be. So it's just going to be that value in pixels and some percentage of the height in height. And then this here is the code that tells Storybook how to handle Next image tag. And lastly, we add our custom viewports. So might have gone a little fast here, but take a look at this file, and with a little bit of time, you should be able to figure out what it's doing pretty easily. I'm gonna save that. And I believe if everything is gone well, we are ready to run Storybook. So Storybook is a tool that, similar to your dev server, it runs on your local machine, runs on port 6006 by default. You can export Storybook as a static HTML directory, which is amazing for hosting it live somewhere and letting other people that are working on your app view and test your components. But for now, we're just going to run it locally with the yarn Storybook command, which Storybook kindly added to our package.json file automatically. So there's the dev build and there's the production build. So we're only going to be working with the dev build for now. So I'm going to say yarn Storybook, starting up on port 6006. Storybook is a fair, I don't want to say finicky tool. Like, there's a lot of configuration involved. You do have to make sure it's set up properly. I'm crossing my fingers here that it's going to work on the first try. Looks like it did. That's great. But don't get discouraged if it doesn't work. Very common for people to have to debug and double check their Storybook config. And of course, like a lot of cool new tools, it has been known to change how it works from one version to the next, so that's something to consider as well. Right now we're using version 6.4. So it opened up my browser automatically to localhost 6006, and I'm greeted with this welcome to Storybook, I'll zoom in a little bit, page, and you can see the sample components that it came with in this stories directory, button, header, page, are right here. Button, header, and page, and I can click on them to see what they look like. A large button, primary button, secondary button. I can click on them. I can change the props here. So really, really good testing tool for React components. Great story. These are what's called stories, different variations of a component to tell a story about how it's supposed to work. I'll try not to sound too much like a Storybook salesperson, but it really is a very nice tool. So it's working well. I'm going to close that for now. Control C to close down my Storybook dev server. Great. All right, so now we're finally going to start building some components. And the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a component template that we can use to, as a shell to copy and paste for all of our future components that we work from. And the idea behind the component template is we want to create a consistent interface where all we really need to do is, find and replace a little bit of text to be ready to immediately jump in and start developing a new component using the best practices that we've laid out and the standards for consistency in our project. So quickly, as I forgot, commit all the Storybook changes. So that's part of our build process. Implement Storybook. Push that. Okay. You can keep this stories directory with the samples. Personally, I don't need it for now, so I'm going to delete it. For maximum cleanliness, I probably should have deleted that before committing it to the previous commit, but that's okay. So I'm going to start in my components folder. In here, I will create a structure. This is where I'll have a bunch of different folders that are basically like groups of similar types of components. So everyone has their own way of doing this. Another one of those very opinionated things. I prefer not to think any more about those kind of things than I need to. I go with whatever everyone else is familiar with or agrees with. So for that reason, I like to defer to, what established people in the industry are doing. I tend to use a package called Material UI fairly often. So when I organize my components, I just follow the same basic pattern that they use in their documentation. Again, you may have your own way, but that would have things like, folders named like inputs, buttons, text inputs, surfaces for things like cards or anything along that line, layout for shells for your page, layout of how your pages look, sections, layout of how different sections in your apps look. I would have another one called maybe utilities, date pickers, app specific widgets, things like that. Basically, and then even in those folders, you might break it down a little bit further, but the idea is to just organize similar components together so that they're easy for other developers on your team to find and everyone's following the same standard. So I'm going to start with a folder called, I'm going to call it templates. And this is where any templates that I use that are designed to build other components from, this is where that they're going to live. And I'm going to create the base template. And for that, I'm just going to call one more folder. I'm going to call it base. And in that folder, so I've got components, templates, base, I'm going to create a new file called base template.tsx. And for that is going to look like, copy it over and explain it. So each of our base components is going to have a CSS module file that goes with the component and is specific to that component. If you're using something other than standard CSS or CSS modules, that's great. You can configure it and do it your own way. I like CSS modules because they're simple. They come pre-configured with Next. But in a later video, we're probably going to talk about implementing Tailwind, and I'll show you how to do that as well. But whatever CSS works for you, just make sure you stick with it. So by default, I want to have a CSS module ready to go with each one of my components so I can quickly just start adding styles. I haven't created the file yet, but I'll do that shortly. I also want to have a default interface for the props for my component. Even if the component doesn't use props, I can leave it empty like so. That's perfectly valid, but you can see immediately that removing that prop has thrown an error and I'm no longer using my base template the way that it's supposed to be used, and that's exactly what I want to happen. If I change my interfaces, I want to see the errors in the components all throughout my app. So I'm just gonna undo that one. We just have a sample, a single prop just to show how it looks, and if you wanted to add more, it would just be adding more here. As for our component, it is a React functional component that uses the base template as an interface for the props for that component. So any of the props that you put here will be available to come here. If I remove this and I hit Control Spacebar, you can see that I automatically get it as an autocomplete, which is very handy. The other one that you get by default for a functional component is children, and that's any children that you put between the tags of your component when you're using it. And you don't necessarily have to use children if you don't want to. And we're simply going to return a div. The class is going to be styles.container, which is something that I'll define in my default module file. And the sample text is given as a prop to this component. And we export it as a default export. So I'll save that. So as you can see, I'm assuming that there's a .module.css file with the same name as my component. So that's what I'll create next. Template.module.css. And we also notice that it's assuming that on those styles for that CSS module, there's a class called container. So I'm going to create a container class, and it's going to be empty, just ready to go to add styles to and get up and running quickly with a new component. The other thing that I'm going to create here is a file called base template.mocks.ts. And what this folder, or what this file is going to be used for is any kind of mock props, just fake data that matches the shape of the props interface so that I can very quickly test a test version of the component either in my app or in Storybook. This should be capitalized. Okay. So the shape of that is going to look like this. I need to import the props from my base template. I ensure that it follows the same interface, sample text, hello world, and I'm going to export here the base version of my prop. And the reason I do it this way, create something called base and export it here, is because I could also later, if I wanted to, have, you know, like an alt version, hello alt world, and then I could take that, and that would be a different test version with different props that I could easily use in my stories or in my app. Just stick with the base for now. So the last file that I need with each one of my components is the story file for Storybook to use. So I create base template.tsx, base template.stories.tsx, and that's going to look like this. And if you don't understand what's going on here, that's perfectly fine. With Storybook, this is the example that they give you. It's the same that you would see if you clicked on button.stories or page.stories in the samples that came with Storybook. I've simply taken it and modified it to use the components, the base template component. So it imports the component along with the props interface. It imports the mock data that we created. You need to create a title of it. The title usually matches the folder structure. This is how Storybook will identify it. The component that it's using, a definition of the arguments that it takes. You can, again, look that up yourself. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining a story. The template for the story that uses the component. And then finally, you do this bind thing here, and you set the arguments. And these will be the props that the components takes in order to render it as a story. So I've used just the mock data. Again, a lot to take in. Feel free to go back, double check it again, read the Storybook documentation, slow the video down, watch it again, try it yourself, and just get an idea what's going on here. Storybook supports lots more options than just what you see here. These are kind of like the minimum default ones to get a story up and running. So I'm going to run yarn Storybook. And hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll see our base component template and a hello world. And there it is. Look at that. And you can see sample text prop. Put it in here, and I can say hello world. Oh, that's great. Excellent. So whenever we're ready to make a real component, we can use this base template, copy it, just change the name, and we should automatically have a story, mock data, CSS module, everything ready to go with our new component. So all we need to do is add the specific application logic and styles that we need. So I'm going to commit that component template. And that's a new feature. We've added a new component. So I'm going to call it add base template component. I'm going to push. Hopefully our production build is still working. So nice thing about this is we haven't really thought about it, but every time that we've pushed, we've verified that our production build is still valid. Okay. So let's use that template to make a real component. Let's make a card. So I'm going to create a new folder in components called cards. And we're going to create a card with a picture of a cat on it, because that's what that's what training videos often do, and that's all I can come up with at the moment based on the sample that I set up originally. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have something called cat card. So components/cards, we're following the same convention. Components, templates, base template, components, cards, and then I want a folder called cat to hold my cat card. And that's where we're going to have all 4 of exactly the same type of files. In fact, I jumped the gun a little bit there creating cat. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to copy this whole component template here. This base, copy. I'm going to paste it in cards. Then I'm going to rename it as cat, so card/cat, and I'm going to rename each one of these files. Bear with me for a moment here. As cat card. And while I'm doing this, VS Code is probably trying to update a lot of the imports. You can see that this file has unsaved changes. This one has unsaved changes. It's been updating the imports as I change the file names. So I'm just going to close all, make sure that they saved. Now the file names are all correct, but inside here, everything is still called base template. So I'm going to right click on this folder. I'm going to use find in folder. Just in this folder, that's the key here. We don't want to do this in the whole project. And I'm going to replace base template with cat card. I'm going to match case. It should be the same. I set it up very carefully so that exactly the right case sensitive replace will update all of them. So replace base template with cat card, and we're ready to go. The only thing that hasn't updated is the title of the stories here, because I created a cards directory and it didn't know about that. So cards/cat card. Now, all I should have to do is run yard storybook. I'm not going to get an actual card because I haven't built a card yet, but I should at least get a different entry in Storybook where my cat card is going to live. Yeah, see? Look at that. Fantastic. Okay, as for the card itself, I'm going to go relatively quickly on this because this isn't a CSS or React component building tutorial, but just to show kind of how it works, I'm going to replace this, the actual content of the cat card with this card here that I have not created myself. I got it from a code pen on the internet. If you check the repository and the blog post, you'll see the attribution for the talented person who created it originally. But I did switch out the image tags for an optimized next image, so I need to make sure that I import that, which I will here at the top. Import the image tag from next image, and you can see I have changed my expected props that this card uses. So update, get rid of this sample prop. My card takes a tag, a title, a body, author, and a time. So because I've defined my interface for what this card needs, I should be able to very quickly and easily control space, author, body, tag, time, and title. Boom. All filled in, all my errors are gone. Now where does that data come from? We're not going to be able to just use this component because it expects us to pass all this. So let's update our mock data. So for some mock data, I've created some here. And again, because we've updated our cat card props automatically, it's already imported from them. It's already reading them because we did a find and replace on the text. Everything is still set up the way that our original component was. All we have to do is change the values and everything will update automatically. So I'm going to replace the tag. What's new in cats? Some lorem ipsum here. Save that. Double check our stories here. We're still just importing the base mock data. That hasn't changed. And the last thing we need is some CSS to make it look nice. So I'm going to click on here. And again, CSS that came with the sample card. I'm going to paste it in this file. You can get it from the repository and the blog post in the description of this video. format, and that should be it. Here's the card itself. This is the component. Our story takes the card and applies our mock props that we created in our mock file. So when I load up Storybook, bear with me here. Localhost 6006. You should get a cat card. You get a beautiful looking cat card. Oh, we don't have an image because I haven't pasted the image in there. So originally I just got a picture of a cat from pixabay.com, you know, free, open source, anyone can use images. So I'm going to copy that over there into my public directory. So that's where all of our static assets for Next.js go. So you can see that the image here is expecting, not that one, sorry. It's expecting /timecat.jpg. So I have that file ready to go. Paste. There he is, cat with a clock. Save. And let's refresh this. There, look at that. That's a pretty nice looking card. See, I can test it on different breakpoints. I haven't done anything responsive with it, so it'll probably look the same on all of them, but it's a fine looking card. One thing that you do, that you do need to do if you're using Next images is you need to validate the domain if you're pulling them from a remote domain. So inside of next.config.json, I need to have this little avatar site that it's pulling from. So I'm going to open up next.config.json, and I'm going to add here underneath React strict mode in the default config images and what domains that I'm allowed to pull images from. Save that. It doesn't make a difference for Storybook, but your Next app will throw a warning if you're using unvalidated domains. Awesome. Well, that works really well. Let's do it. New feature. You know what? Once I start working on the app, I like to do a preemptive yarn lint to make sure that I've fixed linter errors before I do my commit. There we go. Git commit -m. That's a new feature. Create cat card. Awesome. Push that. We're getting very, very close. So the next thing that we're going to teach you how to do is how to use Next.js's layouts feature. So the really nice thing about layouts is that it will allow you to create layouts with your pages and maintain the state of those layouts between page transitions. So if you go from your home page to your contact page or whatever it is, and you have a sidebar, it won't have to re-render that sidebar when you switch to another page that's also using the same sidebar. So the way that we do that is as follows. So I'm not going to take time to make these one at a time. I have a template that's kind of ready to go based on Vercel's example template from GitHub. And I'm just going to copy that over just to give you an idea of how it works. Not focusing so much on how to build layouts, because that's not the topic of this tutorial, but more on what the layout feature in Vercel, or not Vercel, pardon me, in Next.js is and how it works. So I'm going to copy the layouts that I have. So I'm here, I'm going to paste. I'm pasting a folder called layouts that uses all the same standards and rules that I created before. So in layouts, I have primary, .stories, .module, CSS, .mocks, mock data for the layout, and then sidebar with a story, CSS, and mock data for the sidebar. Sidebar doesn't have mock data. It's just hard-coded to have a home and an about page. And actually, I have not yet implemented auth. That's in a later stage of this tutorial, so I'm just going to get rid of the auth layer and just have a basic home and about sidebar there. So to use these templates, I have this is a sidebar layout component, and I have the primary layout component. Again, before you implement these yourself, I encourage you to look at the repo, see how they are, see how they function. Within our pages, normally we just have a, like a default component called home, uses the next page standard interface, has a head, a main, a footer, and it exports default home. And this is where the file name or the directory name would be the route that you go to access that page. So just in pages as the root index.tsx, we should, I need the server to be running, but we should just be able to go to localhost 3000, and this is the component that we're going to see. Which is the case, right? I look, scroll up. Welcome to Next.js. Welcome to Next.js. So I'm going to update this home template to look like this. I'm going to make it a lot smaller, a lot simpler. So I'm doing a few things. Our template, we're going to have our cat card on there because we made it, so let's use it. The mock props just to test it out. I'm going to get the primary layout and the sidebar layout. So these are the layout components that I just pasted into my components folder, primary and sidebar, and we'll see how we use them in a second. This, like everything else, has a CSS module, and it imports an interface. Instead of next page, it's next page with layout. And the reason we haven't created that type yet, but the reason that we need to is that for one reason or another, Next.js next page interface doesn't automatically come with the type definitions for the get layout function, even though, at runtime on the object, that function exists, that function is supported. The types don't seem to acknowledge it. So we've created our own custom interface that extends next page called next page with layout that knows how the get layout function works. So I'm going to take a brief pause before explaining this part, and I'm going to jump over to that type definition. So in pages, I'm going to create a new file called page.d.ts. .d.ts is a type file, something that doesn't have actual runtime JavaScript code in it, just types. And the type that I'm going to create imports next page and exports next page with layout, which extends the existing next page, but adds a get layout function and a layout component type to next page. So I save that. And now this should successfully be able to import that. Might take a second for it to pick up on it. If you ever get, this is a little bit of an aside, but something that I absolutely love. If you ever get in a state when you're working with TypeScript where you feel like you've made an update or changed a file name and TypeScript just doesn't seem to be picking it up, sometimes you feel like, oh, I got to close VS Code, open it up again. You can manually restart the TypeScript server in VS Code. For Windows, the command is Control-Shift-P. For the command palette, and Mac, it's probably Command-Shift-P. And you'll see here, restart TS server. If you don't see it there, you can type restart and you'll find it. It'll come up. Click that, and what that will do is it'll just restart the TypeScript server in VS Code and pick up on any changes that it hadn't caught before. Pretty handy little thing to do. Sorry, brief aside there. So this is the default look of our home component, but we can create a custom layout. So the page here that's being sent to this get layout function is the page that we've created, but it's going to slot it inside our primary layout which within it has our sidebar. So the page will go with the sidebar inside the primary layout. And the benefit of doing this is, like I said before, if you switch from one page to another page that uses the same layout, it will not re-render, it will not create these components, it will just slot out the interior page that's inside of them. So I'm also going to create, in order to test it, we need a page that we can change to. So I'm going to create a page called about.tsx, and I'm going to use this sample, again, from Vercel's layout tutorial repository. It is a next page with layout. It's just some simple HTML sections, p tags, but you can see the get layout follows exactly the same layout as the home component. So when I save this, I'm just going to reboot my server just to make absolutely sure. Now, when I go to localhost 3000, I will see that I don't have my sidebar because I missed one critical step. We have to update our app.tsx file. So what we are going to add here is we are going to add, similar to the page with layout, we're going to add app props with layout, which has a component that matches the next page with layout. We're going to then use the layout if it exists. So get layout function is a component's get layout function. Otherwise, it's just a component that returns itself. And I need to here we are. Use the app props with layout on my app. That should fix my type errors there, and it does. And finally, what we're going to do is, instead of returning this component with page props, we're going to wrap it with get layout. Now, if you don't understand exactly what's going on here, that's okay. I didn't understand what's going on at first. Still tripped you up a little bit. This is mostly just one of those things where, you read the layout documentation in Next.js. They give you these examples. They say, here, take this code, put it in. It works great. And gradually, kind of the more time you spend with it, the more you realize, oh, I see what it's doing. You don't have to completely understand every piece of it from the get-go. But I did want to give you this template because the examples they give in the documentation are not in TypeScript. So this, combined with this custom page interface, will help you get this setup up and running with TypeScript. So save it now. And now let's check what our app is doing. Aha. So we have this sidebar. So I'm on the home page here. So I could manually go to the about page, or I could click here. And my assumption is that when I switch over to this, it's not going to re-render this component. So how do you know if it's re-rendering these each time you click them? I mean, just from clicking them, you can't really tell. So I'm going to open up my network tab with console with F12. I'm going to click. I have these are browser extensions, the React Dev Tools. I'm going to click on components. I'm going to find my, here we go, primary layout. Here. I'm going to switch between them and watch. You can see primary layout and sidebar layout are not changing at all, even when I switch back and forth between page routes. So that's extremely cool. What do we have left? I think just deployment. It's great to have deployment last because when you're using Vercel, it's very, very easy. So that's what we're using. Next.js is owned by Vercel, so no surprise there that deploying an app on it is very easy. We're going to use the managed hosting service. We could, at this stage of the app, we could just do a static export. It doesn't use any dynamic props or anything like that, but just to make sure you understand how to use one of the managed services like Vercel, or if you for some reason don't want to use Vercel, you can host a Next.js app on pretty much any of the major ones: AWS, Netlify, Azure, probably Heroku. I've never done it, but I'm sure you could, and whatever else the flavor of the month is at this point. Really, the biggest benefit of Vercel is just knowing that they have first-class support for Next.js, because they are the owners of the product, and it really is super, super, super easy. I mean, I'll show you right now just how easy it is. So I'm going to do one more commit. Got a new feature. We implemented layouts. Push. Okay, so I'm going to go to vercel.com. I'm going to, hold on one sec. I'm going to log in with GitHub. Okay, there. So I've logged it. This is the one that I was testing on before, but I'm not going to use that. I'm going to create a brand new project. I'm going to check, I'm going to import from a Git repository. So I've already given Vercel access to my GitHub account. I'm going to select a repository on my account. I've given it permission to specific ones. It doesn't have permission to the one that I want to use because I just created that in the last couple of hours of making this video. So I'm going to need to adjust permissions to give it permission to that repository and then import it. And I'm just going to do that. Take a moment here and do that. So I've done that now, and you can see that it appears here. I'm going to import it. Great. Root directory, that's fine. The only thing that you really need to change is the build and output settings, and that's only if you've been following this and did the same as me, where we used yarn instead of npm. So our build command is yarn build, and our install command instead of npm install is yarn install. We don't have any environment variables, and that's it. Like, that's pretty much exactly it. You can see it building. It runs and builds pretty fast on our machine, so I would hope it shouldn't take too long to build on the service. What's really nice about this is it's watching your Git repository. So just from connecting it like that, it launched now because I hit the deploy button. But from now on, I don't even have to hit that button. Every time I push to remote, it's going to launch a deployment of the project on another test URL for me, which is great. And not only that, every time we push, we've set it up so that we're not allowed to push to the remote repository unless a production build succeeds. So we have a lot of confidence while working on this project that as long as our environments are the same, and that's its own set of challenges, which we can talk about later, but if it's building locally on my machine successfully, we can have high confidence that we'll be able to get a successful build on production here and be able to test the live site. So no shortage of warnings, which is par for the course with the NPM ecosystem. But we got compiled successfully, generating pages, all the same things that we see on our machine when we when you run it. And oh, congrats, you just deployed a project. It's got some fireworks, a picture of a cat, which is a good sign. Click on it. There, that's it. Our app is live. It's deployed. Every time I do a push and make a change, it's going to deploy again. It's very easy. It's not much to complain about. So I think that's where it's been quite a bit already. I imagine this video is pretty long. I think that's where we're going to end it for now. There's still lots more that I want to add. I want to get a actual real app up and running. I want to get some API routes connected. I would like to get some fetches to the backend. There's a whole backend system set up here on this pages/API. Hello, response.json John Doe. Like, we haven't even touched any of that yet, so I want to get that set up with a sample app. So we'll do that in a video next. I want to show authentication with Next.auth, which is a super fantastic package if you want to do things like single sign-on with auth providers, like, log in with Google, log in with GitHub, really easy. Or you can roll your own with your own credentials and all the fun challenges that come with that. I want to get a database connected. So with that, we would use certainly Prisma as an ORM. And then with Prisma, you can pretty much drag and drop almost any database you like. You can use Postgres one day and then SQL Server the next day, and then I think even MongoDB the day after that. Like, it's a singular interface for all the different databases you want to use. But we would probably do our tutorial with Postgres and Supabase because it's easy and it's free, and Postgres is an industry standard for SQL databases. I would want to show how to implement internationalization. I don't know about you people watching this video, but I live in Canada, so everything that I do needs to exist in both English and French. So that's just par for the course for pretty much all the apps that we build. So I'll show you how to implement I18 Next into your app, along with a tool called I18 Nexus that I really like, which basically is just an online form CMS-like thing where you can export your translations as static JSON files and do automatic translations through Google Translate. And maybe if we get all that done and we're still on a roll and we want to look at how to set up a monorepo around this kind of thing, I would maybe have to come up with a second app to use as an example. But all the different monorepo options we have for that, we could, if you want to keep it really simple, we could just use Yarn workspaces, or if you want to get really involved, we could use Vercel would certainly recommend Turbo Repo, but NX is another good choice as well. And that pretty much covers it for this tutorial. So I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to leave some comments, reach out to me. I'm happy to answer whenever I have time for it. Sometimes it takes me a little while, but I really appreciate the feedback that I've gotten on my other videos. So that's really wonderful. And, like and subscribe and all that stuff that YouTubers say, I guess. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day. Bye-bye.